When I turned onto Birch Hollow Road, I didn't recognize it at first. The trees were taller, the road freshly paved, and every few yards stood those perfect white mailboxes, all uniform, all stamped with a tidy blue Lakeshore HOA logo. 10 years ago, this was just a quiet lakeside stretch with gravel shoulders and old cabins tucked between the cedars. Now it looked curated, like someone had scrubbed every ounce of personality out of it and replaced it with HOA-approved order. The last time I'd driven here, I was 30. My father had just passed away, and grief made everything dull and heavy. I'd closed the cabin up myself that year, sealed the windows, drained the pipes, packed the last of Dad's tools into storage. I told myself I'd come back once things settled in Chicago. Then work took over, then time slipped. A decade disappeared like fog. The cabin had never been for sale, never rented. I kept paying the property taxes every year, quietly, automatically, like keeping a promise. When I finally decided to come back, to fix the roof, clear the overgrowth, maybe even make it livable again, it was supposed to be simple. I just wanted to see the lake again, to stand on the porch where Dad taught me how to fish. But as the truck crested the hill and my cabin came into view, the world tilted. Someone had paved the driveway. The mailbox was gone, replaced with a shiny steel one that read Henderson in bold black lettering. My last name wasn't Henderson. The front yard, once overgrown and wild with clover and weeds, was now perfectly trimmed. There were patio chairs on the deck, a barbecue grill, potted flowers. A child's bicycle leaned against the steps. I stopped the truck in the road and just stared. At first, I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. Maybe GPS had glitched, or the address numbers had changed when the road was repaved. But the mailbox post still bore the faint carved initials my dad had etched himself decades ago. The cedar fence I'd built with him when I was 15. It was there too, repainted but unmistakable. This was my property. My cabin. I got out, gravel crunching under my boots, and walked toward the porch. There was laughter inside, a woman's voice, then the sound of dishes clinking. I hesitated. 10 years away or not, I knew every inch of this place. The steps creaked the same way, the porch light still hung crooked. My stomach tightened as I raised my hand and knocked. It took a moment before the door swung open. A woman stood there, mid-50s, platinum blonde hair, the kind of permanent smirk that told you she'd never been told no for very long. She wore a white blouse, gold earrings, and an expression that mixed curiosity with irritation. "Yes?" she said, her tone clipped. "Hi," I began carefully. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my property." Her eyebrows shot up. Then, to my surprise, she laughed. That kind of dismissive, practiced laugh people use when they think they've already won the conversation. "I don't think so," she said. "This property belongs to the Lakeshore Homeowners Association. My family's been living here for years." I blinked. "Excuse me." She leaned casually on the doorframe, clearly enjoying herself. "We took possession of this cabin after it was deemed abandoned. I'm Karen Henderson, HOA president. My husband and I oversee all properties on Birch Hollow." The name hit me. Henderson. "The mailbox. You live here?" I managed. "Yes," she said, smiling now like she was doing me a favor by explaining. "The previous owner disappeared years ago. The taxes went unpaid. The county transferred ownership to the HOA, and we've been maintaining it ever since. Now, unless you have business here, I'd suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." Something inside me went still. The tone, the smugness, the false authority, it all scraped against something primal. "I am the previous owner's son," I said quietly, "and the taxes were never unpaid. I've been paying them every single year." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then reappeared sharper. "That's impossible. The county declared this property abandoned in 2018. I took a step closer. "Then maybe you should check your records again." Her face hardened. "You're trespassing. Leave now or I will call security." I looked past her into the living room. The layout had changed. New furniture, new paint, framed family portraits of the Hendersons hanging where Dad's fishing trophies once were. My childhood memories had been overwritten like data on a stolen hard drive. "You're living in my father's house," I said, "and I'm not leaving until this gets sorted out." That was when she lost her composure. "Get off my property!" she snapped. "You can't just walk up here making ridiculous claims. If you think this house belongs to you, go get your fake documents somewhere else. We have legal ownership. I'll have the sheriff here in 5 minutes." Good, I said. Call him. Her eyes narrowed. You don't want to do this. I already am. We stared at each other for a long moment, her fury clashing against my disbelief. Finally, she slammed the door so hard the wind chime above the porch clattered. I stood there a long time, staring at the door, heart pounding. I could hear voices inside, her shouting to someone, probably her husband, some guys claiming this place is his, followed by muffled laughter. I turned and walked back to my truck, hands shaking. The smell of cedar and smoke filled the air. The lake glimmered behind the trees, indifferent. As I started the engine, a cold, quiet thought settled in my chest. This wasn't just trespass. This was theft. I drove into town, my head spinning. I hadn't been back in a decade, and now I was realizing just how much had changed. Birch Hollow wasn't just a quiet lakeside anymore. It was an HOA-controlled kingdom. Every business bore the same seal. Every flyer listed the same HOA contact number. Even the local sheriff's office had a community liaison badge with Karen Henderson's name under it. At the motel, I dug out my laptop and opened my digital records. I'd kept everything: tax payment confirmations, bank transfers, property insurance, the deed with my father's signature. I cross-checked the county's online database. My address still appeared, but listed under Lakeshore HOA. The previous owner field said unknown. That wasn't a clerical error. Someone had erased my family's name from the system. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office, the same one Dad used to take me to when I was a kid to renew property tags. Behind the counter was a man in his 60s, name tag reading Paul Reeves, deputy clerk. He looked tired, polite, and vaguely disinterested until I mentioned my issue. What's the address? He asked. 24 Birch Hollow Road. He typed it in. His brow furrowed. Says here this was transferred to the Lakeshore Homeowners Association in 2018 due to unpaid taxes and unclaimed status. That's impossible, I said. I've paid the taxes every single year. Here, I handed him my printed receipts. He adjusted his glasses and scanned them. These are legitimate receipt numbers, he murmured. But they're not in our database. What do you mean? He looked up at me, cautious now. I mean, they existed once. These were issued by this office. But they're gone from our records. Like someone deleted or replaced them. Someone inside the office? He hesitated. It would take admin-level access. Only a few people have that. Myself, the treasurer, and the county records manager. I could tell from his tone that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Who was the records manager in 2018? I asked. He flipped through a logbook. Dennis Hart? Still work here? He shook his head. No, retired last year. Lives out near Birch Hollow, I think. Of course he did. By the time I drove back to the motel, the anger had crystallized into focus. Someone had forged documents to hand over my property, and the HOA president living in it had the arrogance to laugh in my face about it. I opened a new file on my laptop and started documenting everything. Dates, times, names, conversations, screenshots, printed receipts. Every piece of evidence would matter later. That night I couldn't sleep. The lake wind outside whispered through the pine trees like ghosts of old memories. I thought about my father, about how hard he'd worked for that cabin, about how proud he'd been when he built it himself. Board by board, I thought about how easily people like Karen Henderson exploited laws meant to protect property, twisting them into weapons. And that was the moment I made a quiet promise to myself. I wasn't going to get angry. I was going to get even, the legal way. I drove back into town the next morning under a pale sun that made the lake shimmer like mercury. The world around me felt smaller than I remembered, tighter somehow. A town that had traded its soul for uniformity. 10 years ago there'd been mom-and-pop shops, messy front yards, laughter at the local diner. Now every inch of it screamed HO perfection, trimmed hedges, sterile paint, silence. I stopped at the county recorder's office first. The clerk, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, looked up from her computer as I approached the counter. Morning, I said. I'm looking for property records on 214 Cedar Pines Road. Used to be under my name, Michael Grant. She typed. The clack of her keyboard was the only sound in the room. After a minute, her eyebrows pinched. Well, you're still listed as owner of record. No title transfer, no lien release. She frowned deeper. But there's a leasehold notation. Signed by a Karen Haldeman. I leaned closer. A leasehold? Who authorized that? Her shrug was weary. Apparently the HOA board filed it under a temporary occupancy clause. Looks like it was renewed annually. Renewed, I echoed, my voice flat. She nodded. Last renewal was 6 months ago. It felt like ice slid down my spine. I'd left this cabin locked and documented, utilities off, taxes paid, no consent to anything. And somehow they'd turned it into a rental property for their president's family. I asked for copies. She hesitated. That'll be $5 per page. I'll take every page you've got. Back in my truck, I flipped through the documents. Signatures that weren't mine, fake initials. A power of authorization that supposedly gave the HOA right to occupy my home in my absence. The signature was a crude imitation of mine, the kind of forgery that would fool no one who'd actually seen me sign something. I took photos of every page, then drove to the local attorney's office. His name was Daniel Reeves, an old family acquaintance who had helped my father draft the cabin's deed decades ago. When I walked in, he looked up and blinked twice before breaking into a surprised smile. Michael Grant, well, I'll be damned. 10 years, huh? Yeah, I said. And someone's been living in my house. That wiped the smile from his face. Within minutes, I had spread the papers across his desk. He read silently, brow furrowing deeper with every page. This, he muttered finally, is fraudulent as hell. The HOA has no authority to file occupancy on private property without explicit consent. This clause here, he pointed, was added manually. That's not county language. That's a scam. So they forged my signature and filed it with the county? I asked. Looks like it. But what's more concerning is the notary stamp. See this? He angled a page under the desk lamp. That notary expired in 2017. They filed renewals until this year. He leaned back, shaking his head. Then they've been reusing an expired notary stamp for years. That's criminal fraud, Michael. Not just civil. That's jail time. I sat there, heart hammering. The rage I'd buried under 10 years of patience began to heat up again. But this time, it wasn't impulsive anger. It was precision, cold and exacting. What do I do first? He smiled faintly. You don't kick them out yourself, that's for sure. We do this by the book. First, we file a cease and desist for unauthorized occupation. Then we subpoena the HOA's financials. If they collected dues or rent from your property, it's theft. We gather every neighbor's testimony. And when the pattern emerges, we file for civil damages and criminal fraud. He paused. You ready to make this public? I looked out his window toward the courthouse across the street. I didn't come back to make friends. That evening, I parked near the cabin again, not to confront anyone, but to observe. From my truck, hidden behind a clump of pines, I watched the house. Through the window, Karen's husband, a big man with a red face, sat watching TV, feet propped on the table that used to be mine. A teenage boy carried a tray of drinks. 2 dogs lay near the fireplace. It looked like their life. It looked like they'd stolen mine. I started documenting everything. License plates of visitors, photos of Amazon packages on the porch, even the sound of their generator humming at night. Every detail was time-stamped, logged, and archived. 2 days later, Daniel filed the initial motion, a formal claim of unlawful possession with supporting evidence. He also sent copies to the county sheriff and the HOA's attorney. That's when Karen finally showed her real face. She called me. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice was sharp and brittle. You think you can just barge back into this community and start throwing accusations? It's not an accusation if it's true. You abandoned the property, she snapped. We maintained it. We paid taxes on it. You're welcome, by the way. You forged documents, I said calmly. You filed false renewals under a dead notary. You and your board have been committing fraud for years. Be careful what you accuse me of, Mr. Grant. I'm the HOA president. And I'm the owner, I said. See you in court. She hung up with a hiss. The next week was chaos. The HOA sent out flyers to residents accusing me of harassment, claiming I was trying to disrupt community harmony. But the more they talked, the more people whispered. Some residents began calling me quietly, confessing that Karen had fined them for absurd things, wind chimes, paint color, unauthorized garden plants. She'd turned the HOA into a private fiefdom, and they'd all been too afraid to fight back. One of them, a retired firefighter named Carl, told me something that made my stomach twist. "She's been renting out your cabin on short-term sites," he said. "Weekend retreats, influencer photo shoots, even some corporate getaways. Always cash. We figured you gave her permission." "How long has that been going on?" "Years, son. At least 5. Her family only moved in full-time after the floods last spring. They said it was temporary maintenance occupancy." I thanked him and hung up, but I could barely breathe. Every illegal lease, every stay, every payment, it all added up to embezzlement and rental fraud. I sent Daniel the evidence. He grinned when he saw the photos. "This," he said, "just turned from a property dispute into a criminal case." The county sheriff served Karen with a notice 2 days later. I was parked across the road when it happened. She came storming out of the cabin in her robe, screaming at the deputy that it was harassment, that she was the authority here. Her husband hovered behind her, pale and silent. The deputy, unfazed, handed her the envelope. "Ma'am, you are hereby ordered to vacate pending investigation. Failure to comply will result in forced removal." I watched her face turn crimson. She pointed across the street, right at me. "You!" she shrieked. "You can't do this to me!" I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just looked back. For the first time, she looked scared. That night, Daniel called again. "The HOA's lawyer reached out," he said. "They want a settlement." "Of course they do. They're offering to vacate immediately if you drop the criminal charges." I thought for a long time before answering. "No, they forged documents. They took people's money. They lied under oath. They can explain that to a judge." There was a silence. Then Daniel said, "I was hoping you'd say that." The next day, I drove past the cabin again. It looked smaller somehow, diminished. A moving truck sat out front. Karen's husband and son loaded boxes while she paced on the porch, phone pressed to her ear, yelling at someone. Maybe her lawyer, maybe the board. Her empire was collapsing in real time. But justice isn't just eviction. It's exposure. Daniel and I compiled everything into a full report. Notarized photos, witness statements, transaction records, even the expired notary logbook he managed to pull from archives. When the county prosecutor saw it, his eyebrows shot up. "This isn't just fraud," he said. "This is a pattern of criminal enterprise." Within weeks, charges were filed. The first hearing took place on a Thursday morning in late March. The air was cold and dry, the kind that made everything feel sharper, every sound, every stare, every heartbeat. I stood in the courthouse hallway, watching the glass doors swing open and close as people shuffled in for their cases. My hands were steady, but inside, a quiet current of nerves hummed beneath the surface. Across the hall, Karen arrived in a tailored beige suit that probably cost more than most people's mortgages. Her husband followed behind, looking smaller now, hair unkempt, face pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She spotted me immediately and glared like I'd personally upended her universe. In a way, I had. Her lawyer, a slick man named Edward Grayson, extended a hand to my attorney, Daniel Reeves. The handshake was professional, but the tension between them was thick as wet cement. When the bailiff called our case, we stepped into the courtroom. The wood paneling, the polished bench, the quiet shuffle of papers, everything had that ceremonial gravity that comes with justice. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a calm but piercing demeanor, adjusted his glasses and looked down at us. Case number 24 CV 2183. Michael Grant versus Cedar Pines Homeowners Association, represented by its president, Karen Haldeman. Karen straightened her jacket as if the title president still meant something. Daniel rose first. "Your Honor, this case concerns fraudulent occupancy, forged documentation, and misappropriation of private property under the guise of HOA authority. The defendant and her board unlawfully claimed residence and financial control over the plaintiff's property for over a decade." Grayson objected immediately. "Your Honor, the plaintiff abandoned the property. The association maintained and improved it for community benefit." Daniel calmly slid a binder across the table. "Exhibit A, Your Honor. County records showing property taxes paid by my client every year since his father's death." Exhibit B, forensic analysis, confirming signature forgery. Exhibit C, notarization logs from a notary whose commission expired 8 years before the most recent filing. The judge flipped through a few pages. The room went silent except for the faint sound of his turning the paper. When he finally looked up, his tone was flat. Mr. Grayson, I assume you have a counter to the evidence of a dead notary being used on legal filings. Grayson hesitated. We will need time to review the authenticity of the county's record-keeping. The judge's eyebrow arched. You're questioning the county clerk's ledger? No, Your Honor, I'd advise you to choose your words carefully, Counselor. Karen shifted in her seat, her jaw tight. Daniel wasn't done. He introduced witness statements from neighbors, Carl, the retired firefighter, and 2 others who had lived under Karen's rule for years. Each testified about bogus fines, verbal abuse, and intimidation. When Carl spoke about the illegal short-term rentals at my cabin, the courtroom murmured quietly. Objection, hearsay, Grayson said weakly. Overruled, the judge said. The witness lived next door for a decade. Continue. Carl's voice didn't shake once. We were scared to speak up. She fined me for leaving my truck on the street overnight. She fined another couple because their flagpole was too tall. When we tried to complain, she said she'd make it disappear like she did with Grant's place. Karen shot him a look that could have cut glass. But he didn't flinch. By the time Daniel rested our case, the evidence pile looked like a mountain. Documents, photographs, audio recordings, witness affidavits, everything meticulously arranged. Karen's side, in contrast, had a handful of deflections and no paperwork to back their claims. Then came the cross-examination. Daniel stood, voice calm but laced with steel. Mrs. Haldeman, can you explain why your signature appears on renewal forms for a notary whose commission expired in 2017? She blinked, forced a smile. Administrative oversight. An oversight that lasted 8 years? She hesitated. The notary, Mr. Stevens, had pre-stamped documents for efficiency. Daniel cut her off. So you're admitting to using pre-stamped documents? Her mouth opened, but no words came out. A ripple went through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Haldeman, you understand that's illegal under state law? She looked at her lawyer, who whispered something. Then, through clenched teeth, she said, I was told it was standard practice. By whom? Daniel asked. She didn't answer. Over the next 2 weeks, the case grew bigger than I'd expected. Local reporters started attending hearings. The town's small news outlet published an article. HOA president under investigation for fraudulent occupancy scheme. Suddenly, people who'd been silent for years began speaking up. Emails poured into Daniel's office, residents from other neighborhoods managed by Karen's HOA consulting firm. They all had stories, lost deposits, phantom maintenance fees, falsified notices. It was a web, and Karen was the spider at the center. The prosecutor's office filed separate criminal charges: forgery, fraud, and unlawful financial gain. The civil trial paused while the criminal case took precedence. It was surreal watching it unfold from the sidelines. Watching a woman who'd ruled an entire community with intimidation now walk into the courthouse in handcuffs, trying to keep her composure as cameras flashed. When the trial resumed, Karen's lawyer tried a new defense: blame the board. He argued she didn't personally authorize the fraud, that she'd been misled by subordinates. But the records told a different story. The emails Daniel subpoenaed showed her signing off on occupancy renewals, approving community reinvestment that redirected funds into her personal accounts, and threatening board members who questioned her decisions. Each time an email appeared on the courtroom projector, she flinched like it was a physical blow. Then, the prosecutor brought out one final witness, a former board treasurer, Elaine Rusk. She walked in nervously, clutching her purse, avoiding eye contact with Karen. When she sat, she looked like she wanted to disappear. But when asked why she'd come forward, her voice was steady. She said no one would ever check, that Michael Grant wasn't coming back. She said the cabin was better off in capable hands. I wanted to quit, but she threatened to fine my daughter's business over zoning. The prosecutor nodded. And did you receive compensation? Elaine hesitated. $2,000 a month. In cash. The jury collectively inhaled. Karen's head dropped into her hands. When the verdict came down, it was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Guilty on all counts: forgery, fraud, embezzlement, unlawful occupation, and falsification of public documents. The HOA was dissolved by court order. A receiver was appointed to handle restitution. Every fine she'd issued was declared void. I got my cabin back, legally, cleanly. without ever laying a hand on her or raising my voice. When they led her out of the courtroom, wrists cuffed, she still tried to turn toward me. Her voice cracked as she said, "You ruined me." I didn't respond, because the truth was, she'd done that herself. That evening I drove back to the lake. The cabin was empty again, furniture gone, floors dusty, windows cracked from years of misuse. But it was mine. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the kitchen counter, the window frame where my father's initials were still carved. Outside, the lake was still. The same lake I'd known as a boy. The same lake my father used to fish in every summer morning. I stood on the dock for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the water. Justice had been served, cold, legal, final. But the victory wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, almost mournful. 10 years gone. A decade of absence turned into a battlefield. I locked the door behind me and looked up at the stars. The reflection in the window was older, harder, but at peace. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel anger. Just the slow, steady weight of closure. The weeks after the verdict felt strangely quiet. The chaos that had consumed the town, the gossip, the cameras, the shouting matches at HOA meetings, all dissolved into a kind of stunned silence. It was as if everyone had woken up from a long, collective delusion and didn't quite know how to move forward. For me, the cabin became a place of slow repair. The sheriff's office cleared out the last of Karen's belongings under court supervision. They cataloged everything, furniture, electronics, even a box of uncashed HOA checks that had been hidden in a bedroom closet. Evidence, they called it. I called it closure. The structure itself was weather-beaten but salvageable. The floors creaked, the pipes groaned, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. But beneath all that was something pure, the bones of my father's craftsmanship. I rolled up my sleeves and began the process of bringing it back to life. Each nail I drove in felt symbolic, like reclaiming a fragment of the years I'd lost. I replaced window panes, sanded the porch, painted the walls the same pale blue my mother once chose. It wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about restoration, of the home and of myself. Neighbors began stopping by. Some brought pies, others coffee, others just stories. Carl came over one morning carrying a toolbox. "Figured you could use a hand now that we don't have the HOA breathing down our necks," he said with a grin. I smiled back. "I could use a dozen hands," he laughed. "Well, you got at least one." We worked side by side, fixing things that had been broken for years. As we did, he told me more about how Karen's rule had shaped the community. "She started small," he said, tightening a hinge. "Fines for trash cans, mailbox heights, you name it. But once she realized people were too afraid to fight back, she went for the money. Maintenance contracts, consulting fees, property management. Everyone was scared she'd ruin their credit or make their lives miserable. And no one ever went to the county?" I asked. He shrugged. "She knew everyone in the right places. Or so she thought. The truth was, fear is a powerful weapon, and she had wielded it masterfully. But after the trial, that fear evaporated. The town started to breathe again. Neighbors formed new committees, not HOAs, just community groups, voluntary and transparent. They fixed roads, painted fences, helped each other without fines or threats. It was small-town America, as it should have been all along. One afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside the cabin. It was Daniel. He stepped out with his usual calm composure and handed me a thick envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "The civil judgment," he said. "The restitution order was finalized this morning. The court's awarding you back rent, damages, and legal fees. About $480,000. I blinked. "That's more than I expected," he smiled. "The judge wanted to make an example of them. And between us, the insurance underwriter for the HOA tried to settle quietly. They'd rather pay out than face a dozen more lawsuits." I took the envelope slowly. "And Karen?" "Sentenced to 3 years, he said. "Eligible for parole in 18 months. But between you and me, the financial investigations aren't done. There's a separate audit opening on her consulting firm. That'll keep her tied up for years." I nodded, staring out toward the water. "I don't feel happy," I admitted. "Just done." Daniel gave a small chuckle. "That's what real justice feels like, Michael. It's not fireworks. It's peace." He drove off, leaving a trail of dust in the late afternoon light. I stood there holding that envelope. the wind rustling through the pines, the lake whispering against the dock. A week later, a young reporter named Rachel Mills came by for an interview. She was writing a feature for the state paper. The Fall of Cedar Pines HOA, How One Man Exposed a Decade of Corruption. She was polite, sharp-eyed, curious. We sat on the porch while I told her the story, the discovery, the fight, the trial. She listened intently, taking notes by hand. When I finished, she asked, "Do you think justice was really served?" I thought about that for a long moment. "Justice, yes," I said finally, "but not redemption." She never apologized. "Not once," Rachel nodded. "Maybe she's not capable of it." "Maybe," I said quietly. "But people like her always think they're untouchable. Until they're not." She smiled faintly. "You mind if I quote that?" "Go ahead." The article came out 2 weeks later. It spread like wildfire online. People from all over the country shared their own HOA horror stories, similar abuses of power, forged documents, corrupt boards. Somehow, my little cabin by the lake had become the spark for something bigger, a conversation about accountability. I got messages from strangers, homeowners, lawyers, even public officials, thanking me for standing up, for not letting it slide. Some wanted advice. Others just wanted to say they weren't alone. It was strange being seen as some kind of hero. I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I just refused to accept theft disguised as authority. But maybe in times like these, that was extraordinary enough. Summer came early that year. The air warmed, the trees filled out, and the lake turned a clear sapphire blue. The cabin was almost finished by then. The last touch was the dock, weathered but sturdy. I rebuilt it plank by plank, remembering the mornings my father and I used to fish there in silence. He'd always said that water remembers everything, every sound, every ripple, every secret. Maybe he was right. When I was done, I stood at the edge and looked down at the reflection. I didn't look like the man who had arrived here months ago, full of anger and disbelief. I looked older, calmer, more certain of what mattered, and in that reflection, behind my own face, I could almost see my father's, proud, quiet. Steady, I sat on the dock until the stars came out, listening to the crickets and the soft lap of the water. The lake had been taken from me once, but justice had given it back, not just the property, but the meaning. Months passed. The cabin became my permanent home again. I started working remotely, doing consulting for a design firm. My days found rhythm, coffee at dawn, work till noon, then repairs, reading, fishing. The simplicity felt like healing. One day, I got a letter from the state attorney's office. Inside was a formal notice. The HOA's entire board had been barred from serving in any community management roles for life. Their assets were being liquidated to reimburse victims. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. And that's better. Karen's house, the big one on the hill with manicured lawns, went up for auction. A young couple bought it. They painted the shutters green, put a swing on the porch, and planted wildflowers in the yard. The symbol of control turned into something human again. Sometimes, when I drive past it on my way into town, I catch myself smiling, not in gloating satisfaction, but quiet relief. The world had corrected itself. The night I finally finished everything, repairs, paperwork, restitution, I lit a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace and sat back with a cup of coffee. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight. I thought about how easily injustice can hide in plain sight, behind titles, paperwork, and false authority, and how fragile justice feels until you fight for it with patience and truth. In the end, it wasn't anger that won. It was persistence. It was faith in the law. It was the refusal to be silent. I raised my mug toward the lake, toward my father's memory, toward everyone who'd ever been wronged by someone who thought power made them untouchable. Then I whispered, not for anyone else, but for myself, justice doesn't need noise. It just needs to stand. And as the firelight flickered against the walls of my reclaimed home, I finally felt what I'd been chasing all along. Not revenge, not victory, but peace.